Hi everyone! In this video we are going to go through the three main selectors that we're going to use in CSS all the time. And actually CSS has hundreds of ways you can select things, but these three selectors are the ones we're going to be using the most. So let's go through. The first one is one we've been doing everything so far, which is selecting an HTML tag and changing all instances of that HTML tag. So here's my style here. So I've changed my H1s to have a gray background. I've got a bunch of H2s. So let's go through and add our H2s. And give them a let's give them a color maybe. Let's give them a color of, from our color picker, let's give them, yeah, that's sort of a nice color right there. So I'm going to copy that hex value and paste it in right here, and there we go. So now all my H2s are that color. But what if I don't necessarily want all of those H2s to be that color? What if my more story I want to be different from my two different sort of ordered list styles down here? Well, there's a way you can do that using something called an ID tag. So what you can do in your HTML, you can identify any tag that you like and give it a unique identifier. Now, this word unique is important. It's actually breaking the HTML rules if you use the same ID more than once in a page. IDs should only ever happen once anywhere on a web page. And then once you've given something an ID, you can use an octothorpe or a hash to select those identifiers inside your CSS. So let's go through and do that. So here's my HTML, and I want more story to have an ID of more. Okay, so now this more ID only identifies this particular H2 tag. And now if I want to select that identifier, I do hash more. And then inside here, I can change the color to, let's just make it purple to save time. When I refresh this now, more story is purple, but all the other H2s are this sort of, I don't know, mint green color. And if you right click and inspect, we can figure out what's exactly happening here. So the H2, it gets this hexadecimal color that we picked, but then because of the more ID, it actually gets replaced with purple. Okay, and that's why this becomes purple here. Now, what if instead of changing this one more story, what if I wanted to change both of these ordered lists? So both of these H2s for the ordered list and the unordered list. Well, you're only allowed to use IDs once on an HTML page, but there's something else that you can use called a class. So class is basically the same thing as ID, except it does not need to be unique. So let's go back to my HTML document here. And let's make my other H2s. Let's make this class equals list title. And we'll do the same thing here. I guess we'll copy and paste. Good idea to copy and paste to make sure you don't typo it. List title, yeah, it's the exact same. Now I'm going to save this, and then my app.css. The way you select a class is by using a dot. So our IDs, you used an octothorpe or a hash. We're going to use a dot or a period character to select our, what did I call it? List title. So let's delete this. We just have the actual identifier. So this class we can then change to be color, let's just make it red. So we refresh this, and there you have it. We have two red H2s based on the class, and if we right click, oops. I know what ordered means. Oh, ordered. That's funny. I would not have noticed that typo if I hadn't selected it. Okay, so we changed it from this hash value to red. And so you can see that it still got the H2 from our line 5 of our CSS. And on line 13 of our CSS, we changed it to red based on the class. And there are no more H2s in here. So this actual H2 hexadecimal value that we picked actually doesn't change anything now, because all of our H2s either have a class or an ID. And now you can actually add multiple identifiers to various things. We could give this an ID of list title. So now it's got an ID and a class. What am I doing? List title isn't an ID. My ID was more. Let's not confuse things. So we're going to have this idea of more and the class of list title. And then the question is, which styling is it going to get? Because in our app.css, we have more, which should change it to purple. But after that, we've got list title that makes it red. And so let's just refresh and see what happens, and then I'll explain why it happened that way. So, oh, I don't want to save this website. I want to save this, sorry. So let's save this and refresh. Okay. So it changed to purple. Let's inspect and see why. So it was blue. The class changes it to red, but then the ID changes it to purple. Now, two things going on here. First of all, this HTML, the web browser has actually fixed my broken HTML. I've got the identifier more in two places. I've got it here and I've got it here. Technically, I've broken the HTML rules. I'm bad and I should feel bad. This is not an HTML5 document anymore because I'm not following the code. So you should never use an identifier more than once. But the reason why I wanted to show this to you was that this more identifier is considered more important than the class. And so basically the way CSS is written, the more specific something is in your CSS, the more important it is. And so that's why the ID overwrites a class, because a class can be all over, an ID only happens once. All right, so those are the three main selectors that we're going to be using. The main selectors are your tags, your IDs, and your classes. But what if you want to style like just part of a paragraph or part of an ID? Like what if I want bookmarks grove, whatever this is, to be a special something or other? Well, what we can do is we can actually add something called a span tag, and a span tag actually does nothing on its own. So if I refresh this and find bookmarks grove, that span actually has done nothing at all. But since we have a span, we can now go into, whoops, you don't need to see that. Once we go into our app.css, we can change our span to have a, let's give it a border. Now, you saw last time borders need to have 3 pieces, and they always need to have the same 3 pieces. So you can actually just do size, style, and color all in one line. So you always do size, then style, then color, and this will give that span a gray border all the way around. Another example, let's say we actually want this whole unordered list with the things underneath to be styled in a special way. And there's no easy way to select that. Like if we look down into our CSS, we've got this. This is an unordered list. I want this as an unordered list and all this stuff are underneath it to all be styled. So one thing you could do is you could put it inside a span tag. Another thing you could do is you can use a div tag. And div tags are basically the same as a span tag, except for one difference, and I'll show you by putting a div around here as well. So I've done a div in 2 spots, and theoretically the div shouldn't change anything. And we'll take a look. So refresh, this div did not change, but this div did. Italic mountains now is on its own line. And that's because a div is a block line element. Do you remember block line elements from before? A block line element makes a new line. It basically forces it into its own different block in CSS. And if I give that a style, so we can see, style equals background yellow, that block goes all the way across the page. And so a div makes a block line element. So in this case, we probably actually want this to be a span because we don't want to interrupt the flow of the text. So refresh. So there we go. Now it's gray around the border because it's a span from our CSS, and it actually stays in line. Versus here, we actually want this to be its own little block of stuff. So if you remember the CSS Zen Garden, they had all those cool blocks all over the page. Those are mostly done with divs. So let's take this div and let's give our divs another border. So in our app.css, let's give divs a border. Let's give it 10 pixels. Let's make it huge. Let's make it dashed because why not? And let's make it pink. There we go. So this div has a dashed 10 pixel pink border all the way around. Okay, so to refresh, span tags are useful if you want to change the styling of something within an element. Div tags are awesome if you want to style a whole group of elements together in a block. And you can put all of your, and you can identify based on identifiers with a hash or based on a class with a dot.